Okay, Karan, you know what time it is?
What?
It's showtime. Today we are doing Tim Burton and the new Beetlejuice film, Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. This is Alex from Los Angeles.
And this is Karan from Los Angeles. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but were both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. Join us as we explore why they matter to us before reviewing the three movies in their filmography that made the biggest impact on us.
This is our Tim Burton episode, like I said
Yeah.
earlier. Pretty excited to talk about not only Tim Burton, but his first film in, I think, 5, 6 years. It's been a while since he's made something. I kind of thought maybe he had retired, to be honest. It seemed
Yeah.
like he just didn't care about making movies anymore. So I'm definitely happy to have him back with us. I'll start with my overall thoughts on Tim. So he's actually been a director who is pretty important to me just as a film enjoyer, but also in terms of me learning about film. I mean, the previous episode that we just did was on Hitchcock, and I was talking about how he was so branded as just a director and he had a sense of his own brand and he was in the TV shows and everything like that. So I definitely knew as a child Alfred Hitchcock was a film director. But if I was a kid, and even maybe when I was a teenager too, I couldn't necessarily look at a movie and be like, oh, that's a Hitchcock movie. Like I knew it was Hitchcock, but I didn't have a sense of Hitchcock style until I became much older and sort of studied things about him. But with Burton, he was the first director where I could, even as a young kid, recognize, oh, this is a Tim Burton movie. Like his aesthetic is very, very visual. And I'm a person who really likes, the visuals in the films. Was very easy to tell when you look at a Tim Burton movie, even as a child, like I said. And it was later I realized, okay, there's some themes, and all of his movies have similar themes that I was able to realize that later. But even as a kid, I think I subliminally was relating to these films, which is always about the outsider, someone
Right.
who doesn't fit in. And that is something I definitely related to a lot as a kid. And I think too, with something that he would always bring into his movies and his work a lot was a sense of dark humor, this gothic macabre. And I don't know whether his works made me into someone who liked that stuff or if I did it anyway. So I just was predisposed to enjoy that type of aesthetic and look and humor and tone. But I just can't separate those two things from me. But he definitely was my favorite director for a very long time as a young kid, as a teenager. And then, I think he fell off a cliff pretty strongly after Planet of the Apes. I'll never remember seeing that, just being so disappointed. And then honestly, I kind of gave up on him sort of halfway through the 2000s and stopped sort of seeing his movies. And it wasn't until later I kind of went back and filled in some of the gaps. But yeah, he definitely still, even to this day, though, go back and watch a lot of those older films, his first, 7 or 8 films, and still, watch them dozens of times, still love those movies. So they still hold up, even though I think he definitely fell off a bit as an artist. And I have some theories as to why, but want to throw it to you for a second, see what is your history with Tim Burton? Was he just as big of a brand and a name and a director over in India when you were growing up?
Yeah, surprisingly, yeah. And I think it's similar things of like without even knowing auteur theory or what that word means, but sort of having this very specific visual style and branding of that this is a Tim Burton movie. I think that happened pretty early and it happened over there too. Maybe this is a spoiler alert, but Batman Returns is actually the first movie I saw in a theater when it
Whoa.
actually came out. I mean, I'd been to the theater before,
Yeah.
but they're mostly older movies or movies playing in like these kind of like not like the way we in LA we have a cemetery and theater, but like that sort of setup where they would
Mm.
project older movies. I'd been to a lot of those, but this Batman Returns kind of has that crown. And I
Whoa,
will
that's
never
cool.
forget that experience of kind of sitting in a theater. My sister was very little and she watched the entire movie with her head turned the other way, which in
Oh no.
hindsight, we shouldn't have brought her because I don't think it's for, anybody underneath. I don't know what the rating on the movie is, but a 3-year-old probably shouldn't be there watching
Right.
this movie in the theater. So I think he's kind of been with me in that sense because that's such a memorable core memory of mine watching a movie in first movie in the theater. And then that whole run that you mentioned of 7 or 8 movies, which I obviously watched later in life, some as a teenager, some in my 20s. It's hard to beat that. Those movies are iconic. They still hold up. I will say though, even just if you disregard the whole thing that his movies after some point just stop being good,
Hmm.
even the ones that are good, I think I love them or I like them more as an association of childhood nostalgia and what they meant to be then. Of course, there are exceptions, there are elements that I can still marvel at and be impressed with and enjoy at a different level as an adult. But I think most of the enjoyment is just remembering of what it was to watch this at an earlier time. And a lot of it just, I don't know, to me, just doesn't add up. And I'm also not very big on fantasy or horror or macabre per se. And sometimes it can feel kind of heavy handed because the themes are very obvious. They are
Hmm.
always there. And
Hmm.
sometimes they land on you in a very kind of gentle and thoughtful, heartfelt manner. And I'll get into those examples. And in other cases, it's sort of over the head. So just as an adult watching these movies again and again, I feel like I have like a mixed bag of emotions. That said, at least from that era, a Tim Burton movie is going to be well made. All departments would be shining and singing across the board, especially the visual, the music. Like you can't
Mm.
beat any of that. And it's going to be a good time, whether you take something deep out of it or no, it's going to be a good time. And you're going to admire the craft behind what he puts on screen and how many people we can say that about? Not many.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of his aesthetic too is down to that craft. Like you can, and maybe
Yeah.
this is why both of us connected so much with him as young kids because
Mhm.
it's so much in the production design. It's so much in the sets and in the costumes and in his collaborations with Danny Elfman that is so much more than just, the actors on a set talking lines. There's or even camera movements. It's like before you even know all that stuff, you can very easily tell what that aesthetic is. And I think your point on seeing the films as an adult, I do think that his movies are very cartoony or
Yeah.
childlike or simple. I don't know really what the word is, but it does feel like something that will mean more to you as a kid, even though you can
Yeah.
appreciate it still as an adult. And I still watch several of his movies, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Beetlejuice, Batman. I watch his movies all the time still now as an adult, but there is sort of, yeah, like a cartoony quality to all of
Yeah.
his stuff that I think could be seen as putting a distance between him and his
Yeah.
more adult audience.
Yeah. And you just feel like you've outgrown it because you know exactly where this is headed, or it's trying to say something in a very simple or, overly underscored kind of
Hmm.
way. But then sometimes that's also the point. Like some of these movies are high camp, and that's
Yes.
by design. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So you
Hmm.
have to kind of meet it at its level. And I think for me, I have to be in that right state of mind. Like I'm not down for camp at all times, and sometimes I am. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that is definitely, I think, part of his tone. There's like sort of a kitsch that he tends to
Right.
integrate into his movies in various different ways that I think is just part of, again, his aesthetic that is makes him so unique and so different, even though he is often imitated. I think there's a lot of
Mm.
other artists or other filmmakers that try to kind of crib a little bit on what he was doing. And even though his stuff, yeah, you might argue is a little simplistic in a way, you still, even if you try to imitate it, it doesn't feel the same. So
It's
there is
not
something
easy to do.
unique. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not easy to do, honestly. There is something very unique to what he does. And I even remember, maybe this is like 10 years ago now, there was a Tim Burton exhibit that was going around several different art museums, all of his different sketches and of
Mm.
each of his movies and the different sets and costumes and things. And I was incredible. Like, and this is back too when I was a little more disillusioned with him. 10 years ago, I was like, he doesn't make good movies in a long time. But you still go there and it just remember thinking when I went through that exhibit, like how many other filmmakers could you really have a exhibit like this at like in an art museum and make it make
Right.
sense? And you see his sketches for each of his movies, the character sketches that he would do himself, and you're just like, wow, this guy is just a true artist in terms
Right.
of like a visual artist, way more than most other directors are. Maybe they're good at one other thing, or they're really good at kind of collaborating with all the different departments, but he really is an artist in that sense. And I think maybe that's why sometimes he is overly simplistic because he's
Right.
very overly dramatic or melodramatic or
Right.
whatever you want to say. But that's part of what being an artist is, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's amazing. Would have loved to check out that exhibition when it was here. Curious what you thought of the new Beetlejuice Beetlejuice.
Yeah, so we'll get into his latest film. This again, his first movie in about 6 years, I think. It's Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. So the IMDb plot summary on this one is after a family tragedy, three generations of the Dietz family return home to Winter River. Still haunted by Beetlejuice, Lydia's life is turned upside down when her teenage daughter Astrid accidentally opens the portal to the afterlife. So, directed by Tim Burton, obviously, starring Michael Keaton, Winona Ryder, and Catherine O'Hara, and Jenna Ortega. So, this is the sequel to the Beetlejuice film, which we will talk about later in this episode. A bit of a spoiler alert there. So, yeah, I was coming into this honestly with, I don't know, tepid sort of optimism. Again, I hadn't really loved a movie of his in a very long time, probably about 20 years, a Tim Burton film. But Beetlejuice is one of my favorite movies of all time. And getting the whole gang back together again with Michael Keaton coming back and the same cast. And I get a sense that Tim Burton was excited about something, that if they wanted to do a cash grab on this and do a quick, make some money, make a sequel, they would have done it 20 years ago. And there've been fits and starts of this movie over the last 20 years of them trying to develop it in different ways, and they never really found the right script. So I went in thinking, like, you know what? Maybe this is the right thing because they're finally making it. There's no other reason why Tim would be doing this, because he turned it down so many other times. And I'll just say, like, high level, I thought it was okay. It wasn't terrible, which I think a lot of these legacy sequels can be. Was it as good as the original movie? No way. Was it as good as like a classic 90s Tim Burton movie? No. But I think it was better than anything he's done in a long time, which maybe isn't saying much.
Yeah.
But I had a good time. I thought for the first time in a long time, and we'll get into more of this once I hear kind of your high level thoughts. I felt that he was excited and his creativity was being unleashed in a way where he felt like he was passionate about what he was doing, instead of just paint by numbers Tim Burton, which is what I'm sort of been feeling over the last 20 years. So
Right.
that's one of my high level thoughts on it. Okay, not bad. What were your thoughts on the film?
Yeah, similar. Maybe I might knock it a little more. I think it sounds like you loved it more than I did. But
Well,
yeah,
I didn't
I
love
went
it,
and
but yeah.
but found it better than I did.
Mhm.
I so this is a huge sort of crime to even admit to, but I'd never seen the original one until
Oh.
in preparing for the episode, and somehow it just
Oh.
got away from me. I just never
Yeah.
got to it. So,
Mhm.
for me, it was like I don't have any relationship with the movie, but at the same time, like, why do we need this? But then to your point, like the intentionality of doing a sequel after such a long time, there must be something to it. I will say, like, it was okay. I didn't want to run away, which is which I can't say that I have not felt with some of the other Tim Burton movies in the last
Uh-huh.
20 years, that I
Yeah.
probably did run away from some of them. So so there's that. But and you could see like some of the creative flourishes and such are in there. But I have to say that I guess what made me sad ultimately was that this movie actually could have been good, or like
Mhm.
really good. I think
Mhm.
the bones are there. And for some reason, I guess we can get into it now, which is that I think the story beats. There's just too many things
Yeah.
happening.
Mhm.
He should have just stuck to a simple story about the main family, and that's that. There's no reason for Monica Bellucci other than the
Yeah.
fact that they're in a relationship together, and all sorts of other things. It's just too much. And then secondly, I don't know how you felt about the visual kind of language of the movie, but it felt like a Netflix movie to me. I felt like I was watching it on my TV.
Mm.
And funnily enough, I'd watched the original Beetlejuice like not long before I watched this one. And there's something so creative and clever, but also simple about the first movie, that it's so intriguing and charming and also funny.
Yeah.
This movie, I mean, people were laughing in my theater, and I was like, I don't know what you guys are watching or what are you on, but I didn't laugh. Maybe I chuckled or smiled here and there, but I don't know. It just felt forced. And Winona Ryder, she's great at kind of what she does, but I think you have to really tap into that eccentricity in the right way. And Jenna and the boyfriend, to me, they felt pretty stiff. And Catherine O'Hara is always a delight to watch, but she's kind of doing the same kind of Mora thing a little bit. So there was that. And Beetlejuice, like their first movie, is not really in it much. Yeah, overall, I just think it was okay. Could have been much worse. So I was thankful for that. That is not the case.
Right.
But I also felt a little sad because I think it could have been amazing.
Yeah,
You
I think there, to your point, there were too many things going on. It almost felt like because they've been developing the movie for so long, oh, we
know,
have four different scripts. We're just going to mash them into one, which I don't think they did here, but it feels like they
it
did
felt like
because
that.
there are too many plot threads going on. I actually felt the Jenna Ortega piece with the boy, like I liked that plot a lot, actually, even though I kind of figured where it was going when it was starting, but I still like, okay, this feels kind of like a good teen soap drama. Like I kind of like that stuff. Like this will be interesting. But
Mm,
then you have Beetlejuice, with his ex-wife, that was piled in there, and then
no
more
need.
things going on with Winona Ryder's character, and then Catherine O'Hara's character, and just there was just too much. They could have stuck to one or two things, and it would have made this movie actually a lot better. And on the aesthetic of it, I actually really liked the way the movie looked. I felt that
Mm,
Tim Burton, for the first time in a very long time, they were like practical sets, practical
that is
effects,
true.
especially after the Alice in Wonderland movie that he made. All of his movies just were too much CGI, and I feel like that
Yeah.
ruined his creativity because it let him do whatever he wanted. It was like a blank canvas; he'd create anything. And I think artists need some sort of restraints, even if
Right.
it's just the natural world put on them that helps make them more creative. I really love the production design in this movie. I thought it was very unique in nowadays in movies where you don't really see this because it is mainly CGI. I mean, I
Right.
loved the sequence. It was like stop motion when they were explaining what happened to Charles, the father
Yeah.
of
Cool.
Lydia. That was really cool and unexpected. I love the sequence where they explained Beetlejuice's origin. It was like this small, like black and white stuff, and it felt like Tim Burton with both those two sequences were again more creative than he's been in a
Hmm.
long time. Like he felt inspired to do something different and not just giving you what you would expect a Tim Burton movie to be like in a
Right.
boring way, but it was just too much. And I think the biggest knock on the movie that I would give is one you pointed out was it's not that funny. There's some good
Or at
bits in
all.
it, and I laughed a little bit, but the first movie, which again we'll get to later on this episode, is literally like every 5 minutes there's a joke, and it's so funny and it's
And
funny and
they're
it's
big laugh moments.
oh
Like the
yeah,
dinner scene is, I mean, I get it. I'd heard of it before and I've seen clips of it, not to get
yeah.
it too far ahead, but it's
Yeah.
iconic.
Right. Right. And just Michael Keaton, the jokes are nonstop in that first movie with
Yeah.
Beetlejuice's character. He's funny in this. He's great. I think he does a great job, slips right back into the role. The right amount of Beetlejuice, they didn't give you too much. They, waited enough, in the movie in terms of introducing him, but he doesn't, I can't think of like one funny line or a funny quote from the new movie. And I just saw it a couple days ago. Whereas the
Right.
first movie, I mean, that's, I think, one of the my most quotable movies. And again, we'll talk more about that. I mean, I quote that thing nonstop to this day. And it's so funny. And I just felt like humor. They could have taken another pass of the script to put more humor into it. Even
Right.
Catherine O'Hara, who I think is usually funny in everything she does, I don't
Not
know,
so
like
funny.
yeah, there weren't
I
enough
felt
jokes.
tired.
Yeah, I was like, okay, where are you going to be funny here? Like, Delia is such a funny character, and she's so good in
Right.
the first movie. And Catherine O'Hara is so talented.
Right.
They didn't give her enough to do. I
No.
didn't think that. So the humor, I think, was the most disappointing thing. Oh, actually, secondarily to that, I thought the score actually was kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
Danny Elfman, I thought was sort of that he was more the paint by numbers thing. I didn't
Right.
think it was just the same score as the first Beetlejuice, one of my favorite scores of all
Yeah.
time. But you just sort of regurgitating the same thing.
Yeah.
Not that interesting. So those are my two reasons what kept it from being really good. But I think for me the production design, the aesthetic, and the fact that I could tell that for the first time in a very long time, Tim Burton seemed excited to be working again. that sort of got me through the film. And I'll definitely see it again when it comes out on streaming, and maybe
Right.
it'll sit better with me the next time I see it. But I think I mean maybe it's also like the expectations of this being potentially terrible and it wasn't terrible sort of inflates my grade a little bit on the film,
Yeah.
because it could have been a lot worse and it definitely could have been,
It
but
definitely could have been.
it's passable. I guess that's sort of the best way to
Yeah.
put it. It's
It's
passable.
passable. And kind of that's what I mean by the Netflix comparison. Like this is a
Mm,
movie you could just put on, I don't know, Friday night if you weren't going out or anything, and it'll be totally passable.
mm,
You might have a
mm-hmm,
few laughs, you might marvel at some things or be intrigued by some things, revel in some of the nostalgia, and that would be that. And then you
mm-hmm,
wouldn't think about it ever again. That's what it felt like to me, which is not bad. It's okay, but it's not good by any means.
mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it ends up being a little bit, now that I'm thinking about it, a disservice to what the first movie means. Because if you're going to come back after 20 years or however long it's been and make something, yes, we're both glad that it wasn't bad, but you also then owe it to the original to make it amazing because you just
Hmm.
didn't do it all this time. So that's kind of ultimately how I felt about it.
Yeah, it sounds like we have similar thoughts on this, and I mean it's doing really well. So I'm
Yeah,
actually
because
glad to
there's nothing
see.
else out there,
Yeah,
also.
yeah, that's true. That's true. But I'm hoping also that somehow, because I do feel that excitement in Tim Burton again, that maybe this
That's
big
true.
success in this, it'll have him kind of make more movies again. Because after Dumbo, the last movie he made, I just get a sense that he's just sort of tired and kind of done with it all. I mean,
Right.
he has tons of money. He seems really happy too, honestly, in his life. And, my theory on why he sort of stopped being good was he got happy. And then he had kids and started to be happy, and then his movies stopped being as good. Not that I wish him to be unhappy. I want him to be happy, but I feel like they just sort of lined up too well with Helena Bonham Carter's relationship and him having kids. All of a sudden,
Yeah.
his movie stopped getting good. But, maybe this will kind of reignite the creative juices in him a little bit, where maybe the next thing he makes will be back to the level that we loved about him in the 90s in terms of what he was delivering. But
Yeah.
so that makes me feel good. It's box office success, and Tim might, maybe he's back, and this is the beginning of that. But he
Yeah.
wasn't back in this one, at least not in the way that I wanted him to be.
Well, speaking of coming back and going back, should we get into our top threes?
Yeah, let's do that.
Every week, we basically share our top threes, and our categories are first love. So, the one movie that first made an impact or impression on us personally. Number two, a masterpiece, a movie that we think just resonates with us, the most. And then wild card, which could be anything from, a movie that might be a bit of a swing or a hidden gem or a big mess or something, where they took a chance. So, with that said, Alex, do you want to share your first love?
So my first love of Tim Burton is Batman from 1989. The IMDb plot summary: The Dark Knight of Gotham City begins his war on crime with his first major enemy being Jack Napier, a criminal who becomes the clownishly homicidal Joker. So directed by Tim Burton, starring Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, and Kim Basinger. So we say first love. I mean, this wasn't the first movie that I saw of Tim Burton. I definitely would have seen Beetlejuice and Pee-wee's Big Adventure before that, but this was the first one where I really uh, associated the name with the aesthetic and realized, okay, Tim Burton, this is a director and this is what he does, because now I can connect it back to not only those other two movies, but his specific stamp on Batman to me was very distinguished and not anything I would have expected. So, like I mentioned on this podcast before, because we've talked about Batman movies in passing, Batman's my favorite comic book character. I've always loved Batman since I was a kid, and my introduction to Batman was through the 1960s Adam West TV series, some early, like older comics from like the 60s and 70s I would be reading as a kid growing up. And then there was a cartoon show on TV called Super Friends, which was like a, very, very for kids version of Batman. And that's what I knew Batman was. And then this movie comes out and it's much darker, much more serious, a very distinct interpretation of Batman that was more gothic, was more goth, was more, Tim Burton. I'll use that word now.
Right.
But as a kid, I didn't know what that was. It's like, whoa, like this is Batman. Like what's going on? Like I didn't know that this could be Batman. And then I actually they used to do this back in the day. They had these magazines they would make and they would sell at a newsstand of like making of the movie. And I bought that because I love Batman. And there's a whole sort of spread in there with like Tim Burton, and I saw what he looked like, and he was, all in black and had this black, dangly hair and had his little black beret, and it was like interview with the director, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this guy, like this is the director, this is the guy who made Beetlejuice and Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and then I started really understanding like what his aesthetic was, getting to know him, associating the name with the picture. So that's why this movie has to be my first love with Tim Burton. And while I didn't see this in the movie theater, like I was too young, I think, to see this in the theater, it was definitely something when it was on video cassette. I rented it in a video store and watched it, and that is sort of what unlocked my not only obviously I love Batman, so double down on that for me because it's a great film, but really taught me who Tim Burton was because it was this different version of Batman, and because I saw him in that magazine and realized like, oh, this is like a cool sort of goth
Mm.
artist guy. Like I love this guy. But I'll talk more about the movie when we kind of get into it, but curious on what your thoughts of Batman when you first saw this movie, Sounds like you didn't see it in theaters either if you saw Batman Returns first.
Yeah.
But yeah, what was your introduction to Batman? And actually, I will say too, I mean, I didn't see it in the theaters, but I remember when this thing came out, it's a giant phenomenon. Like you
Oh,
couldn't
I bet.
escape it in the US. I'm curious if in India it was just as prominent with, Batman being everywhere, the Batmania summer of 89 that it
Yeah.
was.
Sort of. Although my memory of watching this movie is on VHS, but at some other people's house because they had older kids and they'd rented the VHS. And I just remember sneaking in and watching like a few images and just had some awareness that this is Batman and that meant something because I'd seen
Mm,
comic books and things like that. I don't think I'd watched any of the other cartoons. I did see the Adam West show, although I can't remember now if that was before or after, but
okay.
I have seen the show.
Hmm.
But then it also felt very dark to me and sort of like this is something I shouldn't be watching,
Hmm.
or this is not for me, or it's too dark and slow and what have you. And so I didn't really watch it until after watching Batman Returns because I was
Interesting.
so enamored by
Ah,
that whole
yeah.
experience that I wanted to go back and watch it and enjoyed it. And I guess now we can get into the movie a little bit.
Hmm.
And then I didn't watch it for all this time until preparing for this episode.
Wow, really? Oh.
Because the thing is that, this movie with Joker sort of stands in the shadow of the Dark Knight, right? When you get
Mm,
that
mm,
and you get this sort of superlative in our pop culture consciousness Joker portrayal by Heath Ledger, it's sort of hard to escape that. And for the longest time, like when I think of the Joker, when I think of the main Batman movie, I think of Dark Knight. So I
hmm.
think this movie maybe suffered because of that, or at least it wasn't top of mind. But boy, watching this again was quite the treat. I I just when I was referring to earlier that there are moments when the camp and the seriousness and the loner person trying to fit in sort of all comes together and maps in a perfect way. I think for me it might be this one. I
Mm.
almost made this my masterpiece. This is how enamored I was just rewatching this movie after this whole long time. And it sings across the board. All of the visual flourishes are there. This Art Deco kind of gothic
Hmm.
Gotham City that they've put together, the characters' motivations. I just think Jack Nicholson, I mean, there are famous stories of he didn't want to do the movie and got a massive paycheck and ridiculous demands in his contract, and he just did it. But this is an iconic performance. It actually feels, I'm very curious to hear from you. Now, I haven't read that many comic books, but it feels very true to that. Like the whole movie feels true to that, but more than its parts, and
Mm.
that's credit to Tim Burton. The storyline, I think Keaton is great. Kim Basinger looks amazing. The chemistry is sort of off and odd, but maybe that's the point. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear more from you. But this movie, just from head to toe, from his character motivations, visual style, amazing score by Danny Elfman, iconic. You cannot
Hmm.
escape that. But also having some meaning behind it. And I think it taps into the fact that Batman is a weird dude. I mean, the whole thing is weird. Like, you are a rich guy, you live in a cave, you dress up in this thing, you go out and you beat people. It's quite odd. And I think this movie taps into that. I mean, who better than Tim Burton to tap into odd, but also has fun with it, which is kind of what's great. And this has always been a thing of the Joker and the Batman being sort of parallels. And I
Hmm.
think that part is also explored pretty well here. Because at some point you're like, who is the odd one? I mean, they're both pretty odd, actually. I mean, of course, one is evil,
Right.
but they're both pretty odd. And then the set pieces also just like deliver. One, actually, I should share that one memory that I did have from my childhood was of the balloon with the gas.
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
That was in my head when I watched it this time. I was like, oh my gosh, I do remember this from a long, long time. It's pretty iconic, and the way they just pull that whole sequence off is absolutely amazing. Very earned and practical effects, and you're transported, but you're also having a good time. Like, I don't know, I could just go on and on, but it felt like this is how a superhero movie should be, actually fun, but also dark and something on his mind. And I don't know, it just felt perfect to me.
First off, in terms of your point about the, standing in the shadows of the Dark Knight, I definitely agree with that. And even that when I was a kid, this was the Batman movie that
Mm,
no one ever thought anything could be topped. And then Christopher Nolan came around, and me personally, and I mentioned this in one of our previous episodes too on Christopher Nolan, like The version of Batman that I liked was the version that he delivered on. And Batman can be a lot of different things, and Tim Burton just had a different take on Batman that worked and was the Batman for a long time. But for me personally, I definitely the Nolan movies are more of Batman for me.
Mhm.
But this movie is still incredibly interesting and unique and a different take on Batman that I still love and can enjoy. And I think that is a lot of it is to do with the Tim Burton take of, like you said, the Batman's weird, right? He's taking this weird aspect of the character, like, yeah, he dresses like a bat, like he's a weirdo, he's an outsider, and that I think is why Tim Burton, as someone who loves outsiders and how does the outsider fit into the normal world, he's viewing Batman more in that lens. I mean, in this movie, Michael Keaton, even as Bruce Wayne, sort of plays him kind of awkward and weird, and he doesn't
Yeah.
really fit in even when he's trying to charm, Vicky Vale. He's not suave. He's
Yeah.
not putting on that air of like the elegant sort of party boy Bruce Wayne that Christian Bale does in the Nolan films. He's kind of weird, and he even in one part of the movie he's hanging upside down like a bat when he's asleep. Like and it's like that's so weird. The guy is weird. He's damaged, and I think that is the part of the Batman character that attracts Tim Burton because he's attracted to outsiders, and that's why he wanted to paint Batman in this specific way. So I think it makes him for an interesting take. And yes, there's the Joker dynamic too of he's also a freak who's an outsider too in the gang, and then he enacts the revenge on his boss, and then across all of Gotham because he's lashing out. So I think it's the Burton version of Batman, which is again, I think what made him so unique, Tim Burton to me when I first saw this film. But I think so much of this other stuff still, despite the me preferring the Nolan films as a Batman film, I think as a movie though, this thing is just so huge and
Hmm.
just so well done. Like the perfect kind of blockbuster in terms of the set design, like you said, the score. I think this might be one of Danny Elfman's best scores. I think still iconic,
Yeah.
an iconic Batman theme, an iconic score, and there's sequences in this film that still are just so cool and just give me chills every time. I mean, a big one, even with the score and the Burton aesthetic, is after Batman rescues Vicky Vale and they're driving back to the
Oh
Batcave.
yeah.
And it's like through this dark woods that looks all
Amazing.
gothic and Tim Burton-y, and then the Danny Elfman score is kicking up, and the Batman mobile's driving through, and there's leaves flying everywhere, and it's just that is Tim Burton,
Yeah.
basically. Like that is his entire aesthetic. It's just so well done. And yeah, like you said too, Nicholson, incredible in this role. And I think yeah, maybe some people might be complaining that he's just playing himself or it's the Jack Nicholson dial up to 10, but yeah, it is, but so what? It works. Like no
Exactly.
one else could have delivered a Joker like this, even though yes, I prefer the Heath Ledger interpretation of the Joker. I can see why people still think this is the best Joker. It's much like Batman, Joker can be a lot of different things.
Right.
There's not one way you can play the Joker, but I think Nicholson's performance here is awesome, and probably at the time was something that's pretty rare. Like a big actor like him
Yeah.
going
No.
out and doing a role like this with an untested director too. I mean, Tim Burton is his third movie, and he's been given Batman. Like that's crazy. A young kid, I think he was like 30 or something when he made this movie too. He's so young, and to come out and be working with someone like Jack Nicholson, who's like at that point even still a legend, film
Yeah.
legend. Just incredible what he was able to get out of him.
In fact, I feel like Jack being in the movie sort of elevates it and gives it a lot of heft. I think, and that's kind of part of the
Mm,
movie in an interesting way, even though he didn't want to do it. But I think it's important that he's there because everybody else, I mean, he has stopped billing in the movie, you know. The
hmm.
movie, it's
That's
actually
right.
more of his story than Batman's story. I mean, that's the other funny thing that Batman in both Tim Burton movies is a side character, in my
Right.
opinion.
Yeah, they don't give him an arc
No.
in on either of the Tim Burton films. And I think that is also maybe why, as a Batman fan, I can see a lot of flaws in the Burton
Yeah.
interpretations. And Tim Burton famously was not a comic book fan.
No.
He was like, I don't read comics. I didn't read Batman growing up. And you can kind of tell that he doesn't have an attachment to the 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 lore and
Yeah.
the character. He has an attachment to the aesthetic and
Right.
what the Batman went through this crazy thing, and he's a freak now. And then that is what Tim Burton latches on to. And even the things like the Batmobile's got guns in it, and in the next movie, Batman kills people and is sort of okay. And so I think there are things here as a
Mhm.
Batman fan that I feel like is not really right with the character, but so many other things work in this film that it's sort of yeah, it's fine. Like Batman can be a different thing to different people, but yeah, I definitely get that sense, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess it's a good segment to my first impression or first love, which I've been teasing this whole time
Hmm.
because it's literally the first movie I ever watched in a movie theater. It's Batman Returns, 1992, directed by Tim Burton, starring Michael Keaton, Danny DeVito, Michelle Pfeiffer. Quick logline: while Batman deals with a deformed man calling himself the Penguin, wreaking havoc across Gotham with the help of a cruel businessman, a female employee of the latter becomes the Catwoman with her own vendetta. Yeah, that logline is very telling. It's the other two people who shine more, and
Exactly.
Batman just happens to be there.
Yeah, he's just watching other stuff
Just
happen.
watching.
Yeah.
As a kid watching this movie in the theater for the first time, you can only imagine like everything is dialed up in terms of the sets and the practical effects, but then really the physicality of its two villains, or I should say Catwoman is kind of a gray character, but yeah, I mean Danny DeVito as Penguin and his whole army and what he's up to, it's I feel like I'm still scarred is probably a too strong of a word, but
Hmm.
it made an impression. It's never really left me. And that sort of is credit to Tim Burton, but also Danny DeVito for like absolute commitment to this insane character. And I would say the same for Catwoman as I grew older and watched this movie over and over again. It's hard to top what Michelle Pfeiffer does in this movie. The whole arc of her from
Hmm.
Selena Kyle to becoming Catwoman, it's just absolutely incredible. And I think this is where this movie, as an adult, now that I watch it, I feel like is sort of camp to the highest. Like this is probably the campiest movie that Tim Burton ever did. And yes, there are themes and there are darker things that are happening, but from the very beginning, the way Danny DeVito's Penguin sort of comes in to Gotham City, that whole reveal, like it's just so over the top. As a child, you're terrified of it, but I think
Right.
now it just feels, I don't want to say silly because it's campy. It's
Yeah.
fun actually
Right.
watching these people. And it's just utter commitment by the actors, but also Tim Burton, every department. And I think it's sort of just what we saw in the Batman, just 10x in this movie. And I think for me, like you were saying, because it's the first movie I watched of his in the theater, all these elements of his like iconography, his themes, his practical effects, the music, it's what I associate with Tim Burton and will always. And that's why this is my first impression, first love. I want to talk more about the movie as we go further, but yeah, what's your relationship with this one?
Yeah, so I also, much like the first Batman, did not see this in the theater. So I'm
Mm.
I'm jealous that you got to see it as
Mhm.
a kid. So I also saw this on VHS when it came out, and I did like it as a kid, though I preferred the first movie. I thought the first movie was more fun. This one was a little slower and just not as like fun. I think lack of the Joker. You take the Joker out of anything, it's not
Right.
gonna be as good. Like as the years have gone by, it just as a Batman fan, it's hard for me to it doesn't sit very well with me in terms of the how dark it gets, but also how like sort of inappropriately like sexual the movie is.
Oh
And
yeah.
it's sort of I've not that I'm against that at all in movies, but in a Batman movie, like I don't really need this much sexual innuendo. It just sort of is off-putting to me a bit. And I will say too, this time I was focusing a lot on, the Burton themes. And this movie I think is, there's a lot of his movies like we talked about are about the outsiders, and the outsiders are the heroes, and maybe they're misunderstood by the populace, and they're who you care about. They're who you want to see succeed. And in this movie, the outsiders really are Catwoman and the
Huh.
Penguin,
It's the bad
both
people.
rejected, right? And they take that outsider status and use it to enact revenge on the society that wronged them, which is something that Tim Burton does very rarely. Usually the
Mm.
outsider is sympathetic. Not that, I mean, you understand what the Penguin went through and what Catwoman went through. I mean, it's especially Catwoman, her arc is incredible. Just so like, a put upon secretary, and then she get, her power and her femininity and strikes back in revenge. it's a great arc, but it's something I think Tim Burton doesn't do very often, which is like the dark side of the outsider and how the outsider can be turned into a bad guy because of the situation that he or she is put in. So that I never really saw before in the film until upon this one rewatch that I just did. But yeah, it's like the dirtiness, the sexual like dirtiness of this movie is somehow just off-putting to me. Like I don't need to see the penguin like groping people. And the dialogue between the penguin and Catwoman is just, I don't know. Maybe it's because I like Batman too much and I just feel it's kind of awkward. Something about it just is like I don't need this. It's gross. Plus, yeah, the penguin is gross, being
Uh,
lecherous towards Selena Kyle or
uh,
Michelle Pfeiffer in this incredible. I mean, yeah, her performance. I think her and Danny DeVito actually are standouts in this.
yeah.
Absolutely standouts. And like you said, Batman. And then the plot summary sort of discusses too, doesn't really do much of anything. He's like kind of barely in the movie. There's no arc that he has whatsoever.
No.
And he's not interesting. Like you want to just follow
No,
what's
yeah. I
going on
kept
with
thinking,
Catwoman, you know?
yeah, when he comes on screen, the movie sort of halts
Yeah.
because nothing much happens.
Hmm.
And also like the oddity of Bruce Wayne, which was kind of goofy but interesting and weird in the first one. Here, it just was like, oh, you should have just gotten Tom Hanks because
Right,
it's
right.
Tom Hanks with like weird, floppy hair. Like, what are you doing in this movie? It's like, because Michael Keaton also is, a weirder Tom Hanks. That's sort of his,
Interesting. That's yeah.
it's not my take. I've heard this
Oh, I've
take
not heard
from
that
other
before.
places.
That's pretty
But
good actually. Yeah, it's a
yeah,
weirdo
it
Tom Hanks.
really
Yeah.
comes to life in this movie. And I just was like, oh, you're not tapping enough into the weird because that's why you have Michael Keaton. Otherwise, you should have just gone for Tom Hanks. So
Mm.
yeah, it's just, I hear you. Like the Batman part is sort of a bummer, and that's why the movie feels slow and drags. But those two are just killing it. They're in a different
Absolutely.
movie, or maybe the Batman is in a different movie. I don't know,
Or not in any
or
movie. He's
not
so
in it.
yeah. Yeah, and he kills some guy in this movie in a way that is still like even as a kid I was like he throws the dynamite in this guy and it smiles when he blows up and
Mm,
maybe just as a Batman fan that never really sat well with me.
mm,
But yeah, on the Keaton thing that is interesting. Yeah, he is sort of he not only does not have an arc, I feel like he's not really even playing the same Batman he was in the first Batman movie. Like he's not that odd guy. And they tried doing some it's kind of like 1930s screwball comedy dynamic between him and Michelle Pfeiffer that just doesn't work. Like Vicky Vale and Bruce Wayne had sort of an awkward kind of like childlike courtship, which is sort of cute in the way it was kind of clumsy, like Bruce Wayne doesn't know how to act around women. But this one just is kind of odd to me. Like it's the romance piece of it
right.
doesn't land. And in a way, like the movie was just Penguin and Catwoman and about them sort of like doing what they need to do in Gotham City and then basically like killing each other kind of at the end anyway. Like Batman doesn't really do much. The
Right.
movie might have been more interesting or just,
Yeah, I'm
unique or
with
something.
you. I will say the sexual chemistry, though it's a lot, but the two of them, I mean, those scenes, though you're like, what is happening and why is this in a Batman movie? They are pretty electric, though.
Oh, they are. I'm not
Yeah.
denying that. It just it just sort of I don't want to see that in my Batman movie. I'll just but it totally works. Like it absolutely. I mean, she just immediately jumps off the screen and
Yeah.
everything she does, especially in that cat suit, is just like
Yeah.
incredible. And yeah, Danny DeVito's amazing, but I just not in my Batman movie.
Not in a Batman movie.
Yeah, yeah.
I also felt this time around like some of the set pieces kind of dragged for me, and I was like, oh, we have to go through another one. People are running
Mm.
around, and the opening one is amazing. But
Oh
then there are
yeah.
just
Hmm.
so many of those that I don't know. I found myself glancing away, or maybe I've just seen the movie way too many times. But yeah, for the longest time, like this was my favorite Batman of the Tim Burton era, and before Dark Knight came along, of course. But
Hmm.
now I'm like, I like parts of this, but it's really Nicholson's Batman is the one that stands out. So that was sort of my discovery from this
Hmm.
rewatch.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think the more times I see this movie, which I don't watch very often because I'm not a big fan of it. Like the more the Burton elements stand out a lot more. And to your point, what you said earlier about it being like the first Batman Burton, but 10 plus, this
Mm,
definitely feels like he could just do whatever he wanted and just
yeah.
did max out all those elements and taking it to the extreme and maybe too far in terms of being more of a Burton movie and less of a Batman movie. I think the balance was a little bit better in the first one. Again, I know I'm biased because I'm a Batman fan, so I'm talking about it from that perspective, and it's hard for me to kind of separate
No, but you
those two
feel it.
things out.
The movie feels imbalanced because of that. Because when your villains are having a time of their life and the so-called hero of the movie is barely there,
Mm.
something is off, you know? Or you just make a movie about the villains, like you said.
Yeah, when maybe he was going through a hard time in his life at this point, like Tim Burton, it's sort of like the Temple of Doom, divorce movie that Spielberg made at that point. I don't know, like I should look at it because it does feel almost like the darkest or like kind of mean spirited as Tim Burton could be, because he's still this
Mm,
isn't like a nasty movie by any means, but
no.
it's a little more of like a harder edged movie than I think he's ever really made. There is a sense of camp and cartooniness, but there's sort of like a darkness in here too that I don't really get from his other films. Even as something as crazy as like, Sweeney Todd, where the main character is like a serial killer, basically. It doesn't feel as dark as this one does. I don't
Mm.
know. Maybe it's who knows? We're gonna have
Maybe
to
it's your
look into.
Batman sort
It
of
could
thing.
be the
I don't
Batman thing.
feel that. Like
Okay, okay.
it's I mean, all of his movies are dark and they even get darker as we go. So I don't feel that. To me, it's sort of more like the camp is just so dialed up that it doesn't often fit with the rest of the stuff that's happening.
Hmm.
Versus, I think the first Batman, the camp sort of feels more gracefully interwoven
I
in
see.
the entire movie. So it's funny because in this movie, the camp is the strength of the movie as well, because it's brought by those two people. But because they stand out so much that it sort of feels imbalanced for
Hmm.
the movie as a piece. But at the same time, the reason you're watching the movie is for those two. So
Right,
it's
right.
just odd, you know? Yeah.
That's true.
Okay. So what is your masterpiece now that we're done with the Batmans?
My masterpiece is Beetlejuice from 1988, the first Beetlejuice. So, the plot summary of this one: the spirits of a deceased couple are harassed by an unbearable family that has moved into their home and hire a malicious spirit to drive them out. Tim Burton directed, starring Alec Baldwin, Gina Davis, and Michael Keaton, Catherine O'Hara, and Winona Ryder. So I'll talk first about why this to me is his masterwork, and then love to hear your thoughts on the movie, which sounds like you just watched it. So I'm definitely curious to hear what you think about that, and then we'll kind of get more into the movie. So, this to me is something where not only is it my favorite movie of his, and I've probably seen this, I think maybe the most times, perhaps Batman, perhaps Pee-wee, but definitely this is a movie that was in constant rotation for me for my entire life, to be honest. I watch this, at least once a year. I feel like this is a movie that is so different and unique. I don't feel like another director could have brought something as weird as this premise to the screen in a way that to be this successful. I feel like this movie you can simplify it down into one line like the plot summary did. It is kind of high concept, but at the same time it's not a movie that I feel like is referencing anything else. It's coming out of completely nowhere. It feels very creative. The Michael Keaton performance, just the character of Beetlejuice, is so out there. I think you would have to have a director that is also kind of out there and full of creativity and artistry like Tim Burton is to even pull the tone of what this movie is off. It's so odd and so weird and so unique. To me, that perfectly exemplifies Tim Burton. And again, like I said, I don't think this movie could have been successful at all without anyone else behind the scenes. And yes, there's all of his classic themes in here about, the outsiders, which in a way are kind of the couple in the movie, like the normal people, Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin as now they're ghosts. They're sort of the outsiders in this world of weirdos, of yuppies, and then the afterlife. And obviously Beetlejuice himself is a total weird psychopath. So I think that was a kind of an interesting twist. You're bringing the squares, quote unquote,
Mhm.
are now the outsiders, which usually in these Tim Burton movies, the squares are not the ones that are giving the outsiders the problems. So I think that's just an interesting twist on his aesthetic. So yeah, I think for me, and also the rest of the production design's amazing, costumes are great, iconic score. I think this is second best Danny Elfman score after the Batman movie that we just talked about. So yeah, this had to be my masterpiece for Tim Burton. And yeah, we'll get more into the movie, but yeah, what were your thoughts of finally seeing this for the first time after it's sort of
Yeah.
being in the culture for so long, and just how much of it you already kind of felt like you had seen before because they were just absorbed through the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think Beetlejuice himself, the dinner scene, all of that I had known of, but had never watched the movie, like I said. But the moment I started watching it, within 10 minutes, I was like, oh, I understand why this is Alex's masterpiece. Because it sort of captures him as in Tim Burton entirely. I would use all the words that you use, and I would just add one more, which is that, I mean, funny, of course, we said that before, but also there's something very adorable about this movie.
Mm,
That's the thing, that this should not feel adorable, but it does, because it's this kind of almost like a dollhouse box with creepy dolls inside it. And you marvel at the artistry and the craft of the dolls, but they're weird and creepy. But because there is a dollhouse, so there's something adorable and magical about it. And I think there's such a fine, delicate dance that he does, from the opening shots of just showing this town, this couple that feels quote unquote normal, but you know something is about to happen because they're so overly excited about their vacation and just
right.
having a staycation, I should say. And there's something odd about that it just feels so idyllic that it's almost off in a way.
Hmm.
But then that's just the beginning. It just gets more and more interesting and clever, and it never feels like, like how some of quirky movies can sort of feel like they're eating their own tail, or
Yeah.
it's become like a hat on a hat on a hat. Like, it doesn't feel like that. It feels effortless, and it actually feels closest to me to the metaphor of Alice in Wonderland. Like, you're sort of falling down the rabbit hole, and things are just sort of happening to you in the most organic way, which is ironic because Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland is barely
Terrible.
watchable. If
Yes, it's his worst film, actually.
it's,
Yeah. I think it's his
yeah.
worst film. Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, I mean, and everybody's great. The score is amazing. Everybody is committed. I didn't actually remember or know that Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis are part of it, because I just think of Winona Ryder, Michael Keaton, and the Deeds family, as I guess. So it was kind of fun to watch them and how sweet they are and odd they are in this whole thing. So yeah, this was definitely going to be on my repeat watching list. I think it just is such a fun time.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm glad you liked it and that it, I guess, lived up to your expectations, or just what you it deserved its place in the culture. It
Yeah.
sounds like, in terms of to what you thought about it. Yeah, I think the thing that is overlooked a lot in this movie is the fact that it is basically Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis are the main characters in the film.
Yeah.
Like, it's their storyline of their kind of acceptance of their fate, and they're learning to live with the Dietzes, essentially. It's about
Hmm.
them kind of coming together, those two families. And Beetlejuice is just this X factor that he's actually kind of the bad guy in a way, sort of, in the
Right.
movie. He's trying to cause trouble with everyone involved, which makes him fun and funny. But it really is about Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis, who are both so good in this movie and just so funny. Again, I
Yeah.
just, especially comparing it to the recent movie, which I thought was lacking a lot of the humor. I mean, this movie, every character has so many different gags. Like, there isn't a straight man in this movie, really.
No.
Everyone is playing for laughs. The jokes. I could just sit here for 20 minutes just quoting this entire movie, but people can watch the movie. I'll save them my Beetlejuice impression. But can't talk more good things about how perfect of a movie this is. And this is something too, I think, a very few movies are perfect, in the sense of, I don't think there's anything that needs to be improved when it comes to the production design is so incredibly the afterlife, the way that they interpret the
Mhm.
afterlife too as a bureaucracy. Like, what could be scarier than that? Like, you think hell would be scary? Like, imagine waiting in line for caseworkers and social work and fill out this form. I thought that was a really fun, unique
It's
take
so clever.
on like what you could do with being dead. Like,
Yeah.
turning into that, I thought is so
Yeah.
cool. Still to this day, I think it's funny.
And it feels very fresh. Like, I, of course, I hadn't seen it before, but like all the characters you meet there, they all look fresh, versus now. And even in the new movie, like the guy with the small head, like you see so many of them. And I was like, okay, this doesn't feel as interesting and fresh as it did in the first one. And it doesn't feel self-serious, it feels very organic in the first one. Like, oh yeah, oh yeah, you're here.
It does feel it's fresh even now. Like, I've seen the movie
Yeah.
so many different times, but it does still feel something unique. But it feels uniquely Tim Burton too. Like,
Right.
not only the design aesthetic, but of course he would think of something about the afterlife for him would still be this like bureaucracy, basically, because I'm sure that's
Mhm.
something too, as an artist, like, he probably never wanted to deal with. You
Right.
don't want to have to deal with approvals and forms and things like that. He just wants to go off and make his art. So this is
Right.
probably the scariest thing for him that is cool. And again, like you said, the dinner scene being so iconic too, I think
Oh.
This is just another element of like kitsch being brought into Tim Burton's aesthetic, using these calypso songs, which, people know the Deo song, but
Right,
they know it as sort of as a like a novelty song, kind of, I guess is a way to
right.
describe it. And him sort of working that into this movie and making the song even more iconic now than it originally was. I think it's just, again, cool and just very much part of his aesthetic. Just so great. Like it's
I'm just laughing thinking about it. Like it's just so good. Yeah.
so good. Okay, so that was my masterpiece, Beetlejuice. So what is your Tim Burton masterpiece, Karan?
All right. So my masterpiece is Edward Scissorhands from 1990, directed by Tim Burton, of course, starring Johnny Depp, Winona Ryder, Diane Wiest. So I picked this movie because maybe the time when I watched it, maybe I was in my 20s, I think, that this whole element of the outsider in this sort of a way who's, I mean, he feels like a teenager to me,
Hmm.
even though he's probably older, but that whole time frame of you trying to find yourself, find love, acceptance as you're growing up, and the world around you just feels what it feels. I think that really made an impression on me. And I think that's why it stayed with me. But after rewatching it over and over, the reason why I think it's a masterpiece because for him is because, of course, all the craft departments are amazing in this movie, but there's something so clever about the fact that your lead character actually creates art in
Mm.
front of you. And you also see the creation of your lead character in the lab, Frankenstein's lab that they show. There's like a lot of meta elements to, because Tim himself is always doing that too, right? So there's something very cool about that you get to see so much great art just created. And yes, it's kitschy and funny that your fences and hedges and your dogs and your hairdos are all insane and crazy, but they are clever and quirky, and I love that about. And then the last thing I would say before I throw it to you is that of all his movies, there is a sense of sweetness and melancholy to this movie that really resonates with me, because usually he goes for big laughs or wacky and weird, and there isn't heart in it, maybe in moments, but like this movie is all heart from the very beginning, from the time when Dan Weiss kind of brings him home to him falling in love for Dan Weiss and Alan Arkin, just like taking him as whatever, they don't even, there's like so much heart in this movie, and it's all about that. Like when stuff falls apart, it is because people are hurting and he's
Hmm.
hurting and you're with it. So I don't know, because of that, this movie is my masterpiece of his.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not surprised you put this as your number one Burton film because I mean you used the word already. I think this is the most melancholic of all of his movies, and I know that is a feeling that you love. So I'm
Yes.
not surprised that's number one. This is a film that I saw when it came out, and I think is easily one of Burton's best movies. It still holds up really well to this day. I think, like you said, every part of this movie, from the production design to Danny Elfman's score and obviously to Johnny Depp. I mean, this is a very early star making turn for him. I think he just does such an excellent job in this movie, which is essentially almost like a silent film performance in terms of
Mhm.
what he's able to give to Edward. But I think what makes this movie, in a way, like I think his masterpiece in the sense of his most personal is it really is a movie about an artist who
Mhm.
is misunderstood and first sort of gets adoration from the people that don't understand him through his art, which in this case is his hedge trimming and then his hairstyling. And then he starts getting adoration from the town. But at the end of the day, he is too of an outsider, too much of an outsider, too weird, too different to actually fit in. The town turns on him, and then he has to go and do his art elsewhere, back in the tower. But the citizens still get to experience his art through the
From a
snow that gets
distance.
created, right? From a distance. So I think that is sort of this maybe Tim Burton's whole, artistic journey, right? Of he has this weird different vision, but if he gets too close and tries to get too much into, the studio system or whatever, you have too many people controlling him, he can't do that. And he has to go retreat to his tower and make his art there, which, as sort of a stereotypical, maybe like tortured artist image, whatever that I have of him, I think that maybe is why he relates so much to this Edward Scissorhands character and why this movie does feel so incredibly personal. Every
Yeah.
time I see it, it just feels like the Tim Burton, artistic journey. And to make it so early on in his career too, I mean, I think it's like his fourth film or something, that is just amazing that he's able to put all of this out there that early
Yeah.
in his journey. But that is sort of every time I see this, I just think of Edward is Tim Burton. It's a great film.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned Johnny Depp. Like, I'm not a huge Johnny Depp fan. I never was, and so is the case with Winona Ryder as well. But I think there's something about this movie and these characters and the way Tim Burton draws them that they are perfect
Hmm.
for, and especially him. Like you said, it's a silent movie performance. And it's so critical, right? Like, this is so odd and weird. And if he doesn't work, the movie does not work at
Hmm.
all. And it's utter commitment, but just so much joy and wonder, like a child almost. The desire to please people and get their validation and acceptance, also like a child, but
Hmm.
also being so sensitive that you're so fragile, even though you literally have knives as hands that you could break. Like, there's
Right.
just so many ironies and like tenderness in that. And Depp is able to tap into that so beautifully. It's just so moving to see that. And I think the silent MVP of the movie to me is Diane Weist,
Hmm.
because you need that other person who sees what the world doesn't see in this person, and she has no questions at all from the very beginning. And that again, you have to buy that, otherwise the whole movie falls apart. Like, oh, why would somebody bring somebody like that home? But you buy that because it's just so unconditional and it's just like a gut response.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah, why don't you come along?
Yeah. Yeah.
No explanation needed. And it's
Right.
just so earnest and so sweet.
Yeah, like adopting a lost dog or something is sort of the,
Exactly.
oh, you immediately, I'm gonna take you in, I'm gonna, show you care and love in my home, even though I don't know who you are and you clearly, have scissors for hands.
Right.
But those scenes, and also too with Alan Arkin, I love sort of the dad and
Hmm.
sort of how he's so matter of fact and also immediately accepting, but just in a different way, not in like a
Right.
loving made, more traditional like dad way. It's like, oh, okay, let me teach you how to do this. Okay, like you're sort of my de facto son. His
Yeah.
dynamic also is so great with
Yeah.
Edward, and just that whole family is so cool. But I definitely agree that Diane is great too, and I love the sort of juxtaposition that the normal quote unquote suburbia, they're the bad guys, and all the Karens of the neighborhood, all the women are kind of running around and sort of causing problems. Like this movie obviously has a lot to of references to like Frankenstein. They're
Right.
definitely like the villagers in the town that don't understand the monster and trying to drive him out. And I love just how he can take the, yeah, again, normal suburbia that in other movies might be like the conformity that you want to have and this ideal perfect, suburb and perfect neighborhood. But actually, they might look at that from the outside, but actually they're bad guys who don't end up accepting Edward, and for a while maybe using him for a little bit too.
Right.
Like definitely that one, I can't remember her name, but the one character with the red hair, she's sort
Right.
of like almost like sexualizing his
Yeah.
talent, which again, as an artist, maybe that's what sometimes you feel, that someone is sort of attracted just to that part of you, even though not you, just sort of like your art. And she's sort of like then again causing problems for him because she's trying to sexualize him, and then other folks are trying to commercialize him. Oh, you should start a business with your talents, and which isn't really what he's trying to do. He's just trying to express art and give art to the world and not make money from it or do this whole thing. So he's sort of getting pushed in all these different directions that society might push you in as an artist, but that's not what he wants. He just wants to express himself through his scissors. And then he
Yeah.
gets to do that. Unfortunately, he does that at the end, but unfortunately, he can't do that with other people. He has to go off on his own to do that, which again
Yeah.
is sad, but maybe that's the life of an artist. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and in on this watch, I was like, first of all, it's pretty clever in terms of the relationship that we see of him with everybody in the town, and there are
Hmm.
different shades to that. Somebody is sexualizing because it's different, and sometimes that can be, sexualized, or the commercial aspect, or oh, we're gonna show you off to other people because you're weird,
Right, right.
and there's people get a kick out of that or whatever. So you see like different versions of that, which I think is pretty smart. Otherwise, it'll get pretty boring, right? That, oh, everybody's having the same reaction to this person.
Right.
But at the same time, like I kept thinking about that, if somebody like this, not an artist, but somebody who literally was like this showed up, it would be pretty odd. It
Hmm.
doesn't matter if you're in suburbia or not. Like it would be pretty odd. And if he has to live in an uncompromising way, meaning not getting rid of his scissors or maybe just keeping two and not 12, you have to go elsewhere.
Right.
It's just how it is. Like, how are you going to, and to give the people credit, like, and I love how they show that people don't pounce on him right away.
No.
Like,
Right.
it
Right.
takes a bit. Like, people are mostly okay initially and they all have their things and what have you. And then it sort of gets out of control. So, in a movie like this, it'll be very easy to just say, oh, the suburban people are the bad people and what have you. But the truth is that it's, yes, they're bad, but everybody is bad and good in some way or the other. It's just more of like this just doesn't fit right. It just doesn't work. I think that's what I end up taking away from this.
Yeah, neither could adapt to one another. I mean, I think that
Right,
I like that part of the movie too, where they keep saying, "Oh, we can fix your hands," which
right,
is sort of what makes him him, and that
right.
it's like taking away his talent, by making him conform by having regular hands instead of scissor hands, and
Yeah,
that would ruin him in a way, and
yeah,
maybe he can't fit in, and he has to just live in
exactly.
the tower,
Because
which is
having
sad.
those hands also doesn't work, because
In right,
he's literally destroying things, like he's
right.
hurting people as
Hmm.
well. So there's that at stake.
Hmm.
So it's not so cut and dry, which is what I like about this movie. It has more on his mind.
No pun intended with cut and dry because of
Yeah.
the scissors, or was that intended? But no, I know I totally agree. I think this movie, even though it's very simple, it's
Yeah,
told, and I love the framing device of the story to the little girl. Like it's framed like a fable and a
right,
fairy tale. I think that's great, but there's a lot more beneath the surface of this movie for sure. I think it is his most personal movie in a way. I mean, he's touched
yeah,
on his, what it's like to be an artist in a lot of his different movies. We're going to talk about Ed Wood in a little bit. That's an artist. He did Big Eyes, another artist. So
right.
he's done this before, but I think this movie feels the most personal,
Yeah,
which
and the
I
most
think,
successful as well, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, I think so. I like
Yeah,
Ed Wood better, but
yeah.
yeah, I think it is in terms of, especially as Tim Burton's aesthetic. I think this is the perfect encapsulation of that. So I definitely think this is another one of his masterpieces. So I'm not surprised for you to put this on your top for Tim Burton.
Last thing I have to mention, I mean, we talked about the production design and the aesthetics of it. Like, I love the whole 50s sort of. I mean, it's sort of, where is this place? What time period is it? Like, it's very
Mm.
odd and it's left to you to kind of figure that out. And that's amazing. But then what tops it is in Frankenstein's lab, when you see the whole assembly line of how it's all practical, I think.
Oh yeah, it
It's
is. Yeah.
absolutely amazing. It made me think of silent movies like the Golem or movies of that era. It has that kind of tactile quality to it. Blown away.
It's so
Blown away.
cool that, yeah, I love that sequence too. It's like also this sort of childlike imagination, which I think is
Yeah.
also what how Burton's mind sort of feels sort of like, not in a pejorative way childlike. I think
Right.
it's just
Wondrous.
yeah, wondrous and creative. I love that sequence too, that Rube Goldberg machine, which
Yeah.
he has in several of his movies, like Pee-wee's Big Adventure opens with one, and then sort of, I guess this is a way to sort of track the kind of decline of his career. There's also a sequence similarly in the Charlie and Chocolate Factory that he made, but it's all CGI, and the wonder just doesn't hit the same. It's
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah, I
it's like with
remember.
the opening sequence of that is the chocolate bar being made, and it just doesn't feel the same as seeing
Yeah.
something that that they actually built. It's just so much cooler. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I agree. Like I love that the Vincent Price is great in this movie, and that whole
Yeah.
aesthetic,
Great casting.
such a great casting. That aesthetic of the inventor's lab is so cool. Yeah, this movie looks so amazing. You want to be in that set for sure.
Yeah. All right. So what is your wild card, which is almost ironic to say with regards to Tim Burton, because everything is a wild card.
Yeah, that's true. You can say that. My wild card is his take on Dumbo from 2019. The IMDb plot summary: a young elephant whose oversized ears enable him to fly helps save a struggling circus, but when the circus plans a new venture, Dumbo and his friends discover dark secrets beneath its shiny veneer. So, directed by Tim Burton, obviously, and starring Colin Farrell, Michael Keaton, and Danny DeVito. Kind of talk a little more about the film itself, but just why I think this is a wild card in the sense of I feel like this movie is a little bit unfairly maligned, and I don't want to call it a hidden gem per se because I don't think it's like an incredible movie, but I do think it's an important part of his filmography, especially his later filmography, that I think deserves to be studied and seen. Before making the case in this, I just want to mention too that we did cover the original Dumbo before, so I'll post the link below in another episode we did in the past. It's one of my favorite Disney animated movies of all time, and this is one of those live action remakes of a Disney classic, which literally 9 times out of 10 are terrible, and just expand movies in ways that no one cares about, ruins the fun of them, takes all the songs away. And yeah, this movie is doing those things. Like the songs are gone, the sense of kind of magic is definitely gone. There's so much extra plot in this movie that wasn't in the original Dumbo, which the original Dumbo is like an hour long. I think it's like
Right.
67 minutes or something. This movie is, basically 2 hours. But what I think makes this movie interesting is when I saw this and whenever I go back and kind of watch the movie, because maybe I've seen it like 3 or 4 times since it
Hmm.
originally came out, it feels to me like Tim Burton sort of in the same way that Edward Scissorhands was kind of like about him being an artist. This to me feels like him kind of looking back on like the death of his career almost and sort of saying, this is what ruined me and I'm now done. It almost feels like this is his swan song as a filmmaker in terms of the I feel like he is Dumbo in this movie in terms of being a unique outsider whose talents are then used for his own enjoyment and then abused by big corporations. And then at the end of the movie, he actually goes, unlike the original Dumbo, he gets freed and goes back to all the elephants in the jungle, and he uses his talents, which is flying with his ears, for his own enjoyment again to entertain his own kind, and he's free of the demands of the capitalist system that was taking him under his wing and trying to exploit him throughout the third act of this movie. And I feel like that really is what has happened or did happen to Burton, especially over the last 20 years when he started becoming just a normal blockbuster filmmaker who just seemed like his heart wasn't in it anymore. And there's a Burton style, and we're gonna hire you to go deliver this style. And he goes and he makes the movie like the Alice in Wonderland or the Sweeney Todd or the Charlie and Chocolate Factory. It's almost like an AI could have gone and said, make me a Tim Burton version of this, and boom, he's making it. And, for better or for worse, those movies did really well. So I
Right.
think he was sort of trapped in this thing, but not having a good time and not enjoying it. And I get that sense when watching this movie, even though after this movie came out too, he said, he had a horrible experience and it almost, again, I didn't think he would ever make a movie again. It felt like he was so over with the whole experience. But I don't know. This movie is, I think, unique in its filmography in that it is, to me, feels like his admission about what went wrong in his own career over the last 20 years and a way of him saying, look, I'm done. Like, I'm free now. I'm just going to go off and just entertain myself. So I think this movie's unique in its filmography and deserved to be studied more than a lot of the other films that he's made in the last 20 years. So I'll get in more of my thoughts on the film, but that's just why I put it on the list and why I
Hmm.
think it's fascinating in a certain way. Even though as a film, I don't think it works perfectly. Though I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people say personally. I think it's still enjoyable on a certain level, but it just fascinated me what I can read into this in terms of Burton sort of exposing him. Thoughts on
Yeah.
maybe his own career. So what were your thoughts on maybe remind listeners what you think of Dumbo, the original, and then talk about your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, Dumbo original is incredible. I haven't seen it as many times as probably you have, but it's one of the most emotional, sweet movies from the Disney animated era.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to top that. And the whole scene of him and the mother and all of that is sort of iconic, And it's a simple story, but it has a lot of depth to it, actually. I hear you on all of that reading, and that's why I think it makes sense for it to be a wild card in that sense, because he's so public, it seems, with his own career and how he's been feeling. My answer to that is that then don't apply that on a classic, you know? Like there's a reason why this movie is a classic. I mean, these live action remakes, like you said upfront, like they are sort of pointless to begin with. But
Hmm.
the last thing I want to see is a filmmaker kind of projecting their own life and admissions on a movie, which is just so far from what the movie is about. It's a different movie. Then don't call it Dumbo, call it something else. It could have, honestly, I would want to watch that movie. Maybe it's Flunko or something else. It's a snail with, really long something else, whatever,
Yeah.
some other character,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
this. And so, but even if I put that on the side, like, I think the movie just doesn't work for me for the most part. I will say though, and we can get into more into the movie, is that there were moments where I was like, oh, actually, this is not so bad. That it kept happening over and over again, which is sort of what made me keep watching the movie. There's something interesting. Oh, there's something interesting happening between Eva Green and Colin Farrell. Like these are
Hmm.
two kind of outsiders in their own world, lost souls. They're coming together, they're helping out each other. That's kind of fun. Or when they do go to the big Michael Keaton circus, like, and a lot of it is CGI, but it actually looks pretty good. Like it comes together pretty good. Danny DeVito is interesting. I think his
Hmm.
character, that you think that, oh, this is a sellout who's going to exploit all the people. But even though he is not as courageous as Colin Farrell's character, but he has his heart is in the right place. And I think that's kind of interesting to see. So there are elements here and there. But I think the biggest failing of the movie is that it's not about Dumbo.
Right. Right.
You have no, even though Dumbo is very cute the way they're rendered Dumbo, but the whole point of the original movie and all these movies from Disney is that you're supposed to fall in love and care for your lead character. And this movie is about everybody else but Dumbo. And Dumbo is just a cute toy in the movie, which is kind of ironic if he's using that as a device to portray his own thing. But maybe that's the point. Maybe he
Hmm.
sees himself as a toy that amounts to nothing. So, but as a movie, it's not a pleasurable experience at all. And then you have all these characters, the children, especially I mean, I hate saying bad things about children in
Yeah.
movies, but like that girl is just, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
really bad. Just looks all of it. Like, I mean, sorry, Tandy Newton. I know she's your daughter. Not that you listen to
That
this
wait,
podcast.
that's her daughter?
I
What?
immediately I was like, oh, the forehead gave away. I was like, oh, I
Oh
know.
my
She looks
gosh.
very
I had
familiar.
no idea that was her daughter.
Yeah,
Oh man.
it's a rude thing to say, but it's just
Oh.
not good. And it's sad to me because Tim Burton actually is a pretty good director of kids. Like he's gotten such good performances from children in his entire career, but not here.
Not in this movie.
But
Yeah.
it's just so much going on. There's no need, so much bloat. And I wish this movie was maybe not Dumbo, or if you wanted Dumbo, should have been stripped down, like a simple movie. Because, yeah, to your point, like all the themes of Burton's characters and stories are in there. And it could have been that swan song if it were only stripped down. But maybe that's his yelp and his cry that even when I'm trying to make that, they won't let me. And it
Yeah.
has all this other paraphernalia and bells and whistles and things on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're definitely spot on in that Dumbo isn't really kind of in the movie at all. And in a
I
way,
feel
it's
nothing for him.
sort of like that's what the first movie is. And if you're gonna make a reimagining, try to do something different. And I think by creating human characters, the first movie didn't have any human characters in it at all. It was just about animals. And if they had taken that path, it would have been something maybe more akin to like the Lion King movies, which are even more
Right.
pointless. They're taking the Dumbo element and creating a story around it. And I really think Danny DeVito, Colin Farrell sort of, but Danny DeVito and Michael Keaton, I think both do great jobs in this
They're
movie. And
good.
they're the ones who are interesting. Like the Dumbo character's not. The kids definitely are not at all. They could have easily been removed and the movie really wouldn't have been affected at all. But it's the human characters that keep my interest in this movie. And I'm definitely not as bored as I am during most of these other Disney remakes. Either they're trying to literally do the same thing as the original, then why are you doing this at all?
Right. I
Or they're
understand.
adding too much that I don't care about to characters that we already had. This movie is creating new characters. And I care about them. It's just the circus stuff to me is interesting, and the Danny DeVito arc of getting absorbed by the Walt
That
Disney
stuff is good.
Company essentially. Like this is interesting, I think, and that's what keeps my interest. Even though Dumbo sort of actually in the second act, it kind of disappears for a while, and it's just
Right.
about how Danny DeVito and Colin Farrell are dealing with this new, being absorbed by the Michael Keaton circus Coney Island thing, and you kind of forget Dumbo's even in the movie. And then
Right.
Dumbo doesn't really have an arc either. There's
No.
not like a big, moment between reuniting with his mom. I mean, I guess that kind of happens at the end, but you don't really care because you don't
You don't
care
really
about
care.
Dumbo. So it
Exactly.
doesn't give you that heartfelt feeling that you do when Dumbo and his mom are reuniting in the first movie. It's like,
Yeah.
oh my God, this is what I, want for this little elephant guy. But,
Yeah.
and they take out the pink elephants sequence, which I remember when this movie was announced, I was like, oh, interesting. Tim Burton with Dumbo. I could see that working. Oh my God, I can't wait to see what he does with the pink elephant sequence, which is that amazing sequence in the first
Hmm.
movie where Dumbo gets drunk and hallucinates all these crazy
Right.
and in this movie they don't do it at all. It's just like
I don't know
they
why. Instead, you have,
there's some balloon elephants or bubble
oh
elephants
yeah.
being made, so they like allude to it. But like that was the one thing I remember when they announced the movie. I'm like, I just can't wait to see what Tim Burton does with that sequence, and they don't even do it. Again, all that being said, I just don't hate this movie as much as I think a lot of other people do. And in terms of Disney remakes, I think it's
Yeah.
actually kind of one of the stronger ones, which doesn't say much because most of them are terrible. But it's this element of I really do think Keaton represents Walt Disney. Burton is Dumbo being kind of shoved in there and being commercialized, and they don't really care about his talents, and they're taking his nets away and they're letting him fail, and if he fails, kind of on him, and then at the end he escapes all that and he just gets to fly with the elephants in the jungle and just be off on his own, like much like Edward Scissorhands, right? He had to go off back to the
Right.
tower. Dumbo doesn't have to be alone, but he just has to be with his own kind in the jungle and free from being exploited by the circus. Which I don't know. I like that. I guess intellectually, when I see the movie, I appreciate that more than I do
Yeah.
actually watching it.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm just reading too much into it, and this wasn't what Tim Burton had in mind. And he, again, I think he just he hated making this movie from what I've heard, and is not proud of it. I don't know. Maybe I'm just seeing something that isn't there, but I still think this
Probably
is a
is.
deserved sort of part of his filmography. I think is more important than was that Mrs. Pettigrew's Weird Children
Yeah.
thing or Dark
Dark
Shadows or some of these
Shadows.
other movies that he's made over the last 10 years, which I think are not good.
It's better
I'll put
than
it that
those for
way.
sure. Yeah, I will say that. But like I said, do not call it Dumbo. Make it call it something
Yeah,
else. It's
that's
better than this,
that's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that was my wild card. What is your wild card for Tim Burton? Why don't you finish it up, Karan?
All right. So I teased it a little bit earlier, but my wild card is Ed Wood from 1994, directed by Tim Burton, of course, starring Johnny Depp, Martin Landau, SJP. Quick logline: ambitious but troubled movie director Edward D. Wolfe Jr. tries his best to fulfill his dreams despite his lack of talent. So you're the one who actually introduced this movie to me, and I think we did an episode a while back where we covered this movie.
I think it was our LA episode, I believe.
Perhaps, yeah.
Or
But
Making
it's
Movies, one of those two. I can't
making
remember.
movies, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it stayed with me because this is probably the only movie I can think of where you're not seeing all the craft departments on steroids and all the visual flourishes of Tim Burton. Like it's one of his few movies that are set in a fairly quote unquote normal world, and it's sort of his most like mainstream, I'm going to make a movie about the movies kind of
Hmm.
movie, which you do once, as a director you've gotten some notoriety and you want to sort of be taken seriously. That's kind of how I always read that.
Right.
But it still has its quirkiness. It still has the same themes of, multiple outsiders at play. But ultimately, I think this movie is about friendship and mentorship, which is, I guess, it has been explored in other of Tim Burton's movies, but not to this extent.
Hmm.
That's sort of the main text and subtext of the movie between Martin Landau's and Johnny Depp's characters. And I think that's actually really sweet to see, because I think creating art with artists often can be an isolated kind of thing, and you see that, right? All of his movies has his hands all over them.
Hmm.
But this movie, though it has all of his hands over the movie, but it's an homage to friendships. It's almost like talking about this movie after Dumbo is interesting because Martin Landau, the older character, is probably at that phase of his life where he's done with, you
Right.
know and now you have this sort of hopeful new person who's come in and who's also an outsider in Johnny Depp's character, and has a different take on life. And maybe, again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, like you probably were, but it's almost like Tim Burton showing two sides of his own life, that maybe he was hopeful and optimistic and wanted to make anything from nothing, versus the old him is probably not that. And it's fun to see those two come together, collide, and obvious, and all in the backdrop of movie making. I love movies about movies, a black and white movie, kind of in the golden age time of movies. Like, that backdrop is amazing. I could watch those movies, over and over again. So yeah, that's why it's a wild card, because it just feels different but yet familiar enough, and I think it's done really well. I think it's probably Johnny Depp's best human performance, by far. So yeah, that's my wild card.
Yeah, this movie is fantastic. We talked about it before, but in terms of wild cultures, I definitely do think this is his first adult movie. Like,
Yeah, that's what I mean.
or,
Yeah.
like, not to say that his other movies weren't like mature in some way, but it's tackling much more mature themes in a quote unquote normal, more non-stylized world. I definitely agree. This was a huge kind of swing for him, and a movie that at the time I didn't see when it came out. It just wasn't, it didn't do very well, I think, initially. It wasn't wide
Mm,
release. It wasn't marketed towards, the more kid audience that the rest of the Burton films are marketed towards. So I
mm,
didn't see this till later. I think it wasn't until I was in college, actually, I actually saw this film and immediately fell in love with it when I first saw it for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. I think it's interesting that you say that it is this friendship thing, because in contrast to like Edward Scissorhands, where the artist doesn't fit in and has to go off on his own,
right.
here all these artists coming
Are
together,
helping each other.
helping each other, right? It's artists kind of banding together. So you don't have to, it's not a solitary thing, because making movies surely isn't.
Hmm.
You have to collaborate, that you can't make a movie if you don't. And I like that he's sort of that new spin on the outsider, not only as collaborators and friends, but I also like the sense of outsider as a or outcast as a rebel in this movie. Like, he's trying to do something different. He's always trying to break down barriers and do something new and fight for his vision too. I mean, I love that scene when he's with Orson Welles, and Orson
Hmm.
Welles is sort of, also down in his career at that time. He'd kind of washed up in a way in Hollywood at this point in Orson Welles' career. And he's talking to Ed and saying, your visions, your artistic vision is something that's worth fighting for. And that is sort of the rallying cry that Ed has. And I think, again, defines Burton as an artist, I think, too, of like, I'm going to fight for my vision. I have a very specific vision, and this is what I want to get across in the screens. And there's sort of a rebellious factor in that. And that's what I,
Hmm.
I like about this movie too. There's that rebel sense of this, which is fun to like go off and make a movie on her own. And, it's an independent movie. And, that montage they have around when they're making Plan 9 from outer space towards the end is so cool.
Mm,
Because that's famously like the worst movie ever made,
right.
quote unquote, it's just, and the movie shooting this is like a triumph of like, oh my God,
Right.
look, we get to see them, make Plan 9 as if they're making Citizen Kane or something. I always find that to be really funny. But also like triumphant. I mean, he lets
Right.
the outcasts win, even though in real life they didn't really, and the movie wasn't successful. And actually, the montage at the end sort of, I think, also underscores the fact that Ed Wood was a real artist, because he died not famous and then he became famous afterwards. And now, there's a Tim Burton movie biopic about him. People are screening Plan 9 all the time. I
Mm,
think I mentioned this in another episode. When I was at USC Film School, there's an Ed Wood Film Festival that the freshmen put
right.
on every year, where they have to make a movie in 24 hours with anything they can find around the campus. So Ed Wood lives on, and I think that's what makes him an artist that he wasn't successful when he was alive.
Amazing, right? And I guess the triumph is in doing it
Hmm.
and just getting to that point. And this movie celebrates that. You know it's not going to be good, because he's like, no, no take. One take is
Oh
fine. He
yeah,
never,
right.
he's like, just for him, it's just like getting it done is the thing that matters. But it's so fun to see the scrappiness of how all this is coming together.
Hmm.
And there's almost like like you said, a rebellious quality, but also like an unprecious quality. Like, he's not sweating over minute details or any of that stuff. It's just like it's almost like he loves hanging out with these people. Like, that's what the agenda is.
Hmm.
What the product ends up being, who cares? It's like,
Right.
we're doing it. That's what's important. And I
Yeah.
love
Me too. Yeah, I love that a lot. I think this movie is really uplifting, even though there are a lot of, the Martin Landau storyline is really
that.
sad
Right.
and tragic, but the way that it deals with those themes in this movie too, I think is very interesting. Like, it doesn't bog the movie down by that
No.
sadness. It almost is just sort of fits well with the overly optimistic Johnny Depp performance too,
Yeah.
where it just feels more rounded. The world
Yeah.
feels more rounded because it has these incredible optimistic highs, but then these really sad, tragic
Yeah.
life that Lugosi's leading.
You could argue that they're the same person, because we have that both things in us,
Mm,
to varying degrees. That the artist and the perfection and the lines have to be right. This is not worth my thing, and but I'm also at the over the hill, and nobody wants me, and the self doubt and all of that. But then on the flip side, there's optimism and just a desire to get it done. My only thing rewatching it this time was that I don't know what the point of the cross-dressing stuff was. Like, you almost don't need it. It feels to me sort of extra. Like, you can just portray the outsiderness of Johnny Depp's character just by his being, because he does feel not from the world. I don't think you needed to add this extra detail. So that was sort of interesting. I don't know if that struck you.
well, I mean, that's real. I mean, he
Oh,
actually was a
really?
cross-dresser. Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
I feel like that probably was, I mean, first of all, he was, but I think it helped add to, just in terms of the narrative, add to him as another outcast and someone who's
Right.
different because he
Another
likes
element.
dressing
Yeah.
in women's clothes. It's just another element of that. But yeah, Ed Wood also was a
All right.
cross-dresser.
That's good to know. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but Johnny Depp, just again, incredible
So
performance. I
good.
think he, like, his goofiness, almost like Burton, it works in the tone of the film. And another way this performance could have been too over the top and kind of hammy, but with what the rest of the tone of this movie, which is a little bit exaggerated anyway, because it's a heightened sense of reality, even though it's grounded at the same time. It's this odd tone that Burton's able to pull off, but I think Depp works really well in that context.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of his best performances for sure
Yeah.
too.
It's
Just
not
the
his best. I mean, this and Edward Scissorhands. So I think this one even more so because he gets to speak.
right, right. He talks, yeah. Yeah, I love it. The cadence of his voice too is so funny. How he talks
Yeah,
in this
and
is so
just
great.
very earnest. It kind of, like you said, it has like a screwball comedy kind of heightened
Hmm.
feeling to it. So yeah, it's pretty great. Pretty
So
great.
great. Yeah. So in terms of what you want Burton to do next, what would you like to see him do?
I think I would like to see him do something simpler and kind of in the Ed Wood kind of mold. Have like a more grounded, more melancholy driven. I think he's at this age and time of his career, like work with a great actor, maybe work with Johnny Depp because he's also in this different era of his life, I guess, and do something smaller with a little bit of magic and melancholy. Like that's what I would want him to do. Less monsters, less practical stuff. Like, yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I was actually gonna say I don't know what tone the films necessarily would be, but I would like to see him work with Johnny Depp again. I think that having seen Burton be more inspired and more creative with Beetlejuice that he has in a long time, I think Depp has also been in a bit of a career slump for a long time as
Yeah.
well over the last 10 or so years and needs to be inspired again, and maybe putting the two of them back together in something. Again, I'm not really sure what that would be, whether it is something more grounded like Ed Wood or something a little bit more out there, like even a Beetlejuice, like that kind of tone.
Mm.
I think putting those two back together would help both of them out, I think. And it's Depp needs it. I think Burton is on the cusp of delivering something I'm hoping could be really good again, because this is sort of, it seems to be him climbing back out with Beetlejuice, and maybe working with an old collaborator will help ignite his creativity. So
Yeah, that could be
that'd be
actually
exciting.
fun to see, or it would be a total trash fire. But
Either way, it might be. Well, I actually, and interestingly enough, Burton's bad movies aren't interestingly bad. They're just
right,
bad. So
they're just bad.
maybe Depp coming back in, they'd make a third Alice in Wonderland movie might actually be good.
Oh
I
my
definitely don't
gosh.
do that.
No, no,
But
no.
it'd be nice to see them back together again. They could
Uh,
do something interesting.
you want to tell our listeners about what are we talking about next?
Yeah, so another director who hasn't made a movie in a while is Francis Ford Coppola. So he is back in a big way with Megalopolis. So that comes out in 2 weeks, and we will be covering that film. And then obviously his filmography. So we'll talk about a lot of his great works and then maybe add another one to that list. I don't know.
I
I'm
don't
very
know.
curious.
We'll find out. Well, that's our episode. Hope you enjoyed our discussion today on Tim Burton, Beetlejuice, and all of his other movies. Be sure to let us know in comments below your thoughts on him and our choices. As always, we are available here on YouTube as well as on all podcasting platforms. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Also, please rate and review us and like this video, as that really helps new listeners find our show. With that, keep it weird.
Yes. And that is why I won't do 2 shows a night anymore, babe. I won't do it.